Thanks a lot. So in November 1963, Robert Menzies was vying for another term in government. He wanted greater political security and an end to what he described as having precariously and unexpectedly survived by one vote for 2 years. His election speech contained all of the expected statements on foreign policy, defence and the economy, immigration, health and housing. Buried in the middle was education. He began by listing his government's credentials in directly improving tertiary education and supporting secondary education through grants to the states. Then he declared his intention to promise something new. He recognised the need to improve science teaching if Australia was to keep up with the march of science. He proposed directly funding the building of science laboratories in school to the value of £5 million per annum. Then came the bombshell. That money would be allocated without discrimination. The decision to fund science facilities directly was connected to the recognition of the importance of science education in a post-Sputnik world, the growing public engagement with science, the example of the Industrial Funds building program, the pervasive Catholic lobby, and the politically volatile issue of what was called state aid. All of these matters converged in November 1963 when the Australian people were called to the polls. Historians have taken a rather narrow view of the 1963 election and the non-discriminatory approach to science education. They have largely seen the issue through the lens of federal government intervention in secondary school funding, especially non-government schools. Marsh called the shift a major transformation, led by Menzies. The decision is invariably referred to as astute, suggesting Menzies recognised the importance of the Catholic vote, which favoured state aid. And we've heard a terrific case for that argument a moment ago. Moreover, he capitalised on the state Labor Party in New South Wales and the federal executive being conflicted over the issue. Perhaps the idea of the significance of the apparently opportunistic timing of the policy shift was only enhanced by opposition leader Arthur Calwell's condemnation of Menzies' decision as conceived in chicanery, born in duplicity and nurtured in deceit. Hogan's interpretation aligned with Calwell's. He described the grants proposed in the 1963 policy statement as best understood as electoral bribes. Tomlinson described Menzies' decision as pragmatic when electoral pressure demonstrated the efficacy of change, resulting in a reversal of policy his government had advocated for 14 years. Connell also prioritised the idea of state aid as the driver of the policy change. He acknowledged the importance of science as secondary and contextual, arguing that when he, Menzies, thought seriously about extending the federal government's financial aid to schools, he should turn to the support of scientific and technical education. More recently, Wilkinson et al. Argued that the science laboratory cause was a kind of lever that made the reintroduction of state aid a little less controversial. Smart said science aid was a shrewd political choice. Most recently, Campbell and Proctor referred to the anti-communist Catholic vote as available for possible seduction. In each case, historians interested in the new policy direction of 1963 focused on science education as an excuse to implement state aid as the primary vote-catching issue. If the 1963 election shift was all about catching the Catholic vote, it is not clear whether this actually had any impact on the outcome of the election. Hogan argues that state aid cannot be given credit for Menzies' 22-seat majority. Instead, he names foreign policy, defence, and the Labor Party's position on American bases. I've argued elsewhere that the assassination of John F. Kennedy only 8 days before the election was also a contributing factor to the Australian people voting for security under the American alliance. Paul Hasluck reported to the Liberal Party that he believed Kennedy's assassination pushed the electorate back towards the government, and public opinion polling supports this view. As well, Menzies gave a telecast in Sydney on the day of the assassination that specifically referenced Kennedy's work in the sphere of Australian defence against the Chinese. By focusing on state aid when trying to understand the political environment of the 1963 election, we miss the significance of science and science education in particular, and at the same time, we skew our approach to the election and its outcome as well. What such a focus has done, however, is to underscore the importance of education to the social and political world of post-war Australia. Put in perspective, Gough Whitlam wrote in his memoir, "The most intense political debate in Australia during the 1960s was not about Vietnam, it was about education." With the exception of the establishment of the Canberra University College in 1929 and a block grant to university research in 1936, the federal government largely remained aloof from supporting education until 1950, when the Menzies government began an inquiry under R.C. Mills into the funding of universities, which led to the passage of support bills in 5 separate years. More importantly, in 1956, Menzies commissioned Sir Keith Murray, former chair of the UK University Grants Committee, to review the state of the universities. Although Menzies wrote that he wanted to bring international authority to the exercise, Martin credits the Vice-Chancellors who advised him to have an international approach. Still, it is fair to say that Menzies believed in the university as an institution, prompting him to act and later to reflect that "I had a strong feeling that the Commonwealth must be the saviour of the universities." Tabled in September 1957, the Murray Report identified the need for more science graduates as a prerequisite to national growth and defence, arguing that no nation today dares, on grounds of national defence alone, to fall entirely behind or to be without its own good number of highly qualified men of science, of the academic or university type. And yet such an ideal could not be achieved without considerable cost and effort. The Murray Report noted a weak focus on science compared to other countries, inadequate equipment in universities, some dating back to World War I, and a poor pipeline of students coming through from the schools. If children at school were not encouraged in science, they either failed to pursue a university course at all, and if they did, they were inadequately prepared and either did not continue past first year or failed altogether. Murray warned that not addressing the situation may well prejudice the future development of the country. Only 1 month after the Murray Report was tabled, the world was transfixed by a small, shiny bauble, a little over 1 metre wide, weighing in at 84 kilos and emitting a detectable bleep. Listen now for the sound that forevermore separates the old from the new. declared an announcer on NBC radio. Sputnik was the epitome of Soviet scientific achievement. It's all that talk about religion. Sputnik was the epitome of Soviet scientific achievement. Its trajectory over the United States was calculated for maximum one-upmanship. The American press went into overdrive and reported on Sputnik-induced panic. Sputnik drew attention to the noticeable differences between the Soviet focus on science, the investment in science education to support it, and the way in which Sputnik heralded the potential for the Soviet military to use space as a battlefield. Devine argued that Sputnik signalled the weakness of American science, the failure of American schools, and the complacency of American political leadership. That did not end until the scientific revenge of the moon landing in 1969. Physicist George Henry Stein was more succinct. He said, "Unless the US catches up fast, we're dead." Although Eisenhower remained sanguine, he was concerned enough to immediately appoint MIT President James Killian as his new science advisor and drafted the National Defence Education Act, which specifically focused on new federal funding of education, supporting students to stay on at school and especially encouraging their study of science and technology. Because the response to Sputnik was linked to the apparent failures of the education system, the moment acted to galvanise education critics and reformists. As Barbara Barksdale-Klaus explained, once the Sputnik panic became an educational crisis, it coalesced with the long and hitherto inauspicious struggle for federal aid to education. It was not that it produced initial interest in such bills, but that it disarmed opposition to federal aid. Now, the spectre of Sputnik and the American story was not lost on the Australian public. The Australian Women's Weekly called Sputnik a new moon. In November 1957, the Australian Parliament discussed Sputnik's implications for national security. The member for New England, David Drummond, asked Menzies specifically if he was aware of Eisenhower's response and the link he drew to university and school science education. Menzies replied that he was working on it, he was looking at the universities already, and that's where he would focus his attention. In this respect, he was supported by Labor's Kim Beazley, who applauded the fact that Murray's inquiry into the universities was initiated in 1956, well before Sputnik induced any sort of panic response. Menzies' most reflective comments on the Sputnik episode and its significance for Australian science, education and national defence came in the third Henry Simpson Newland oration in March 1958, entitled Modern Science and Civilisation. And this was a theme that Menzies would return to several times in the coming years. He rationalised the need to encourage the pursuit of science without losing sight of the values of an education in the humanities. Menzies was supported by Kim Beazley again, who wrote that many tyrannical regimes have fostered science, but no tyrannical regimes have fostered those faculties of the university that deal with human affairs, sociology, and those fields of thought where criticism of tyranny is likely to emerge. Regardless of Menzies' restrained embrace of science, the Sputnik era generally excited the public as a gateway to the future. There was an inquisitiveness about science and a broad marvelling at its potential. At the opening of a new science building at Scotch College in 1962, Len Robson, who was the former principal of Shaw in Sydney, captured this sense of wonder. He said, "Surely, if there ever was a time for enterprise and boldness, for venturesomeness, and for the exercise of imagination in the making of schools, this is the time." Now, Menzies' idea of a civilised nation rested on the bed of humanities. It was long, dearly held and deeply personal. He told a school audience when opening a science block, "I associate myself a great deal with the humanities." Moreover, he had little personal inclination for science and admitted to a paucity of experience with it. He said, "I was the kind of fellow who gets through examinations rather easily, you see, except in science and mathematics." As a result, his own background and education to emphasise even more his conversion to the view that science was the subject for the new age, for the improvements medicine and biology brought to human life and the way discoveries in physics would bring economic and political advantage. And he made this connection explicit 7 months before the election speech that translated these beliefs into policy. He said, "I am utterly convinced that we must pay an increasing attention to scientific training, to scientific discovery, to scientific application, if we are to be well in the march of time." By 1963, the popularisation of science had increased dramatically, aided by the Sputnik media storm and the efforts of dynamic individuals who wanted to address the paucity of science education in Australia, particularly Professor Harry Messel, the University of Sydney. He introduced a number of science schools, firstly for teachers and then for students. And they began in 1960 to draw a television audience of some 100,000 viewers. The Australian Women's Weekly called this one of the most exciting developments in Australian TV, while underscoring common attitudes to women and their ability in science. The Women's Weekly said, "The lectures given by some of the foremost scientists of the world have been adapted so that the most traditionally bird-brained woman could understand and enjoy them." Significantly, scholarships to attend Messel's summer science schools were equally available for boys and girls. They were described as being without discrimination. Messel was unequivocal. "It's not a question of whether a girl wants to know something about science. She must know something about it if she is to be a first-class citizen." So Menzies was directly lobbied, most significantly by the founders of the Industrial Fund, led by Len Robson from Shaw, and F.E. Trigg, who was chairman of CSR. Now, Robson and Trigg were aware of a British scheme to build science laboratories, and they thought this was a good idea. And when they heard Menzies give a speech about him wanting to pour money into universities, they began to think that this was not going to be a sensible idea unless something was done about science education in schools. They thought it would be a wasted investment. And so they successfully built science laboratories for what they called independent boys' schools of standing. Now, these were 61 schools that came out of the Headmasters' Conference. By June 1964, 30 projects were completed. By 1967, the work of the fund had paid up over $1 million to build science laboratories in 37 schools. The school selection process was rigorous. The school needed to be able to put in at least 20% of the costs. They had to have high academic standards, good governance, and the students had to demonstrate an interest in science. Most notably, no girls' schools received funding under this scheme, although Harry Messel claimed that it was the girls' schools that were in greatest need. Trigg said that the girls' schools would have been considered if the money had reached that far, but it never did. But in reality, we know that science was a male domain, a view supported by Carver, the executive officer of the fund. So here we come to Menzies and the 1964 Act coming out of the 1963 election. Menzies acknowledged the work of the Industrial Fund and he approved of it. Similarly, the executives of the fund believed that their work was Menzies' inspiration for the shape of his new policy. He was often called upon to open the science blocks that the fund built, and he was intimately acquainted with the program, its costs and how it worked. And he was also practised in justifying the building of laboratories. He said, you can't teach science in the modern world unless you can also put into the hands of the student the things they are needed to illustrate to him, to give him the feel of the developments that have occurred in physics and chemistry and in a score of other subsequent and perhaps more refined studies. Whereas Menzies was unmoved by those lobbyists who advocated for federal involvement in education as a general principle, such as the Australian Education Council, the Parent-Teacher Education Council, the Australian Council for School Organisations and the Premier's Conference, he was deeply impressed by the Industrial Fund. And the link between the operations of the fund and the policy change of 1963 are indisputable. Menzies did not go to the election advocating federal funding of school education, but rather federal support for science education through Clause 96 that allowed for special grants to the states. And when Menzies went to the election in November 1963, there was no implementation plan for his new policy, which might suggest that he capitalised on Labor's prevarication to support science laboratories and fill the void. After the election, he called in John Gorton and made him Minister for Works, assisting the Prime Minister. His job was to implement the States Grants Act of 1964. And under Prime Minister Harold Holt, Gorton became the first federal Minister for Education and Science in 1966. Gorton called the Science Block scheme a watershed in Australian politics. He and Menzies were both aware of rumblings within the community around sectarianism, but Menzies made it very clear that he abhorred sectarianism and would not countenance division over the science funding. In his memoir, Menzies described sectarianism as something that nauseated him, even as a youth and as a member of Parliament who needed to represent all of his constituents. Gorton was also unequivocal that the scheme was never intended to please the DLP. However, Menzies did address the sectarian debate in 1964 at the Cardinals' dinner. He denied he was cultivating Catholic votes and argued strongly that his support of science laboratories was because it was a sensible idea. The policy was introduced, he said, because Australia needed scientists. They needed to be better trained, and students need to be better prepared when entering university. He was quite blunt when he painted the scenario of being criticised for not distinguishing between government and non-government schools. And quite frankly, he said, whether it is through stupidity or otherwise, I just don't understand how any such distinction can be made. He made sectarianism out to be absurd in the case of supporting a purpose of high national significance. Moreover, he said, the Commonwealth Government coming in to give some special assistance for a special purpose has no right to discriminate. Menzies went even further and struck a personal note saying, if I had to do that, I wouldn't want to be in public life. To conclude, there is no doubt that Australian science and science education was inadequately serviced during the 1950s and 1960s. When Menzies proposed to contribute $5 million each year to improving science provision, he was responding to demonstrable need, highlighted but not introduced by the Sputnik propaganda value in 1957. As well, the efforts of the Industrial Fund proved that science laboratories in schools were necessary to deliver the new curriculum, and the fund provided a method, plans and demand. The significant thing about the 1964 Act that Menzies introduced is that for the first time, support for science teaching was offered to all children, regardless of the school they went to, whether it was government or private, irrespective of the religion of their parents. And what is often lost in the historiographical arguments around state aid, Menzies' scheme did not differentiate between the science education of boys and girls. The term without discrimination meant that all children were offered the chance to experience learning in the age of science. As Menzies told the audience at Geelong College on opening their new science building in 1964, one is so to improve the scientific equipment in the secondary schools as to give every boy or girl who has a scientific bent an opportunity to be much better trained, much further forward, much more accustomed to handling of new techniques and new equipment than ever before. And I am sure that this is going to pay enormous dividends in the development of the universities, in the development of science, and therefore in the development of Australia. Thank you.
Well, if there's no one with their hand up, I'll start off. I was wondering if you could speak to Australia's sort of track record of science education prior to the 1950s, where you sort of mentioned, say, in our universities, we had equipment that was still left over from World War I that they were trying to teach science with. Does that mean that we were actually reasonable around that era of, say, the 1920s? Was it a sharp drop-off, or was it something that we were always behind?
I think the reverse is true. When you come to the 1950s, you get a sharp uptake in the need for science, a different sort of science and a different sort of teaching. And I think what you see then is the inadequacy of science education for a new era. And people in the universities and in the public and in government were talking about the way in which life had changed and science had changed. And in order to keep up, then we needed to do something different. And so I think it's that rather than we were good once and now we're not, I think that what happens is that science and technology takes off in a new direction, and everyone was trying to catch up. And when you have Sputnik occur, then everybody looked and thought, oh my gosh, the Russians have achieved something in science and technology, and now we are behind. And so there was this interest in increasing that push.
Thank you, that was excellent. One thing that you didn't mention was the atomic bomb in 1945.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you found any evidence that that contributed to, for instance, you mentioned increased popular and public interest in science, and then sort of culminating in the Sputnik launch. Did you find any evidence that the atomic bomb shifted Australian attitudes either at a political or a public level towards science?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I did mention was the role of Harry Messel, and one of the things he pushed was that students need to know about nuclear physics, and he was very keen to see a nuclear reactor in Australia. And so the nuclear energy debate and the atomic bomb was all part of that discussion. And so one of the science schools was specifically on nuclear physics. So yes, it's absolutely in the mix. And it was not so much the debate that we see now as to whether the nuclear field was good or bad or a problem or not. It was that this was the new era and people needed to know about nuclear physics, and Australia needed to be in that nuclear space of debate.
Just one quick one before we... have we got in the call?
Yes, just a short question. In the 60s, there was quite a brain drain. We had wonderful scientists here who packed up and left and went to America.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that had some effect, or I don't know, but, you know, we lost quite a few that would have been important for here.
I think the whole story about science education was about pipeline. So we couldn't get students properly trained in the schools. They were not entering the universities adequately prepared. They were not completing science courses. And then those who did complete They were not then returning back into education. A very, very small percentage of people who completed a science degree went back and became teachers. Those who did pursue science as a career would often work in industry because there was more money there, and then they could go overseas. So yes, there was a brain drain, and we were not supporting science well enough within the schools or within the universities. So what you see in this period is a development of new science curriculum in schools, the building of laboratories, the getting of equipment, the increased training of science teachers. Some large proportion of teachers teaching science in schools were not trained in science at all. They were PE teachers or English teachers or whatever. So there was a greater push to get them actually trained in science. They were only often 2-year trained, so they didn't even have enough experience in science. They were not up to date with the new science. So every area needed work, and the idea about the laboratories is that when the curriculum was changing towards a more practical curriculum, there was nowhere to teach that, and students were studying science sitting in an ordinary classroom and not even mixing anything in a test tube. They didn't have the facilities, they didn't have the equipment, and even demonstration schools where they were taking in students from teachers' colleges or universities to do prac teaching, even those schools were not properly supported to teach science well. And of course, the paucity of women teaching was in science was extremely low, and the pay differential was part of the problem there. So a woman coming out as a teacher had to work 6 years before she got the same pay as a man coming out in his first year. So the woman was paid less, so it took her 6 years to catch up. And so that's just the pay for teachers. And then science teachers argued that science teachers should be paid more to encourage people to go into science. So everywhere you look, there were problems. So I think one of the things about introducing the science laboratories was as a way of supporting big infrastructure builds that cost a lot of money and could be done in one sort of parliamentary act, because once you had a laboratory, then you could then sort of teach the curriculum in a better way. So all of these things flowed on, and I think the point you make about brain drain is actually one of those many factors. So there was lots of things that needed to be fixed.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks a lot.
So for the past 18 months or so, James Waghorn and Gwilym Croucher have been working as fellows of the Robert Menzies Institute on an oral history program documenting Commonwealth scholarship recipients,